Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCS Winners Round number 2 overview and analysis video. Always excited to do some playoff content, and we just had a couple of really fun series here in Winners Round number 2. Of course, the stakes are very high today. No one is going to be getting eliminated because we are still up in Winners Bracket, and so it's not do or die for any of these teams, but remember, the qualifications for Worlds coming out of North America are entirely based on how you finish in the Summer Split playoffs, which means the two teams that do end up winning in the series here today guarantee themselves a spot in the main stage, the Swiss stage at Worlds this year. And so, very big stuff coming in from both of these teams. We're going to know our first two representatives from North America at Worlds after these two series, because again, obviously top 3 is confirmed for this section, so I'm really excited to go over it. But of course, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of this series. What teams do you think did well? What teams do you think definitely need to improve? And of course, do you think those teams will bounce back once they get into the lower bracket? But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Of course, if you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate in each individual game. I'll also be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, as well as a player of the series at the end of both of the series that we are going to cover today. Of course, if you stick around to the end, you'll get some predictions on the lower bracket round number 2 that's going to be happening in the upcoming weekend. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. There is a lot of good stuff to cover, and we get to kick it off with what I consider to be the more interesting of the two series on paper moving in to round number 2, and that is one between the number 1 seeded Cloud9 and the number 3 seeded Evil Geniuses. Cloud9 picking this part of the bracket, wanting to play the winner of EG and TSM. I think they were just trying to dodge Team Liquid, if I'm being entirely honest. That's kind of what I expected. They assumed that Team Liquid was going to be coming through round 1. They've had a rather difficult matchup into them over the course of this year, and of course, Energy is also a team that is quite scary, but, getting Evil Geniuses on this side, that certainly doesn't make it easier. I will say, however, Cloud9 has done a really good job of being able to take away what Evil Geniuses' strengths are over the course of this regular season when they run into them. They're 2-0 for a reason, and that's because I think Cloud9 has been the most efficient team in the entire league at dealing with JoJo Pune. Obviously, JoJo is such a major part of what Evil Geniuses does in terms of their game plan that when he ends up getting shut down, a lot of the games that they try to run through him just don't work nearly as well. I've talked about this in my playoff primer video. I don't necessarily think that the other players on this team are incapable of winning without a player like JoJo. What I think the problem is that Evil Geniuses' entire game plan revolves around moving JoJo around the map and playing with a numbers advantage, and when they can't do that, their game plan just kind of falls apart typically, or the way that they individually have learned how to play the game has just kind of falls apart right in that situation. I think Cloud9, more than other teams, has been able to take advantage of that, but I do think that obviously EG has enough talent on this team to be able to win without JoJo, and that's not to say that JoJo's just going to have a bad series by any means. I think you could argue that he's more talented than Eminus. I think that there definitely is a conversation to be had there, but I would probably take JoJo over Eminus, even if it is really close in terms of actual talent. Cloud9 just likes to invest a lot of resources into shutting down JoJo, and if they continue to do that in the series, it is a lot going to be on, Revenge and Unforgiven and whoever's playing in the jungle position, which we'll get to in a second. But for Cloud9, they've got a lot of other options, right? First of all, if you do invest into Eminus, all of a sudden you have a really strong mid laner, and Eminus can carry games, and that's scary. Fudge is really good, even if I do think he's in worse form at the current moment than a player like Revenge. And obviously, Berserker or Blabber could carry a game very easily. I consider them the 2 best players in North America. And so, Evil Geniuses definitely has a tall task ahead of them, but I think this is a relatively poor matchup for them, and I think we saw that a lot in the regular season. But first things first, there is a little bit of a substitution to talk about in this series. Shaden is actually going to be out to start the series, and Armeo was actually back in. Very interesting decision, especially with NACL Finals basically coming up in a couple of days after this. I assume Armeo is going to be playing in those, as he's played the entire playoffs for Evil Geniuses challengers, but he will be stepping in here to play with the LCS team. Not exactly sure if this is a full, reintegration into the starting roster, or if it's just a 6-man. I don't really know how they're going to do this, but it is worth noting that Armeo is going to be starting in this series. And so, with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into it. Of course, if we're going game by game, that means we got to start with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Cloud9. They are able to take the first game in this series. It's a 1-0 series lead, and this very much felt like a regular season version of Cloud9 versus Evil Geniuses, but with a little bit of spice, a little bit of flair added into it, because Evil Geniuses actually was in a super good spot here, and the ending to this game is absolutely wild. I suggest you go check it out. I usually don't, kind of direct you guys over to a game, but this game was a lot of fun to watch, and I really do think it's worth a watch. If you haven't seen it already, this was just an action-packed game, basically from moment one. It ends up going pretty long, but Cloud9, basically by the skin of their own teeth, end up walking away with the win, purely because they can't really deal with Berserker, which is a really difficult thing to end up happening, considering Berserker is on probably the most supportive AD carry in the entire game at the moment, and you had a super fed Aphelios. For Berserker to be the highest damage in this game is incredibly impressive coming in from him. But again, Cloud9 employing a strategy that we've already talked about. Berserker is going to get my player of the game. It really is a little bit different for Berserker than it is for any other AD carry. He is so clearly the best player in North America, in my opinion, in terms of individual talent. Like on a game-to-game basis, he has the most mechanical skill of anybody in the region, and I don't think it's particularly close at the current moment. And games like this only further propagate that idea in my head, because you look at Ashe, you look at this champion that, quite frankly, has just not been very good around the world. We've seen it picked up, but typically speaking, it's very negative for the team that ends up picking it. Not only does it do a significantly less amount of damage than any other of the major AD carries in the current meta at the moment, Aphelios being one of them on the other side, but even the more supportive style aspects of her game just aren't as good when you don't have something following up with it. Now, if you want to pick it with something like Tristana in the mid lane, I think that can be a pretty good avenue, because you are giving Trist or Jace or one of these more aggressive, even something like an Akshan, right? You are giving them more opportunities to be able to kind of do their thing in late game team fights, because you are setting them up relatively well, and you're still doing damage. It's just not a ridiculous amount of damage, but that's not how Berserker plays Ashe. This was a hyper carry in Berserker's hands, and I just don't know how he does it. How does he do so much damage on this champion? Nobody else can do this kind of damage. He really is that much better than everyone else he's playing against. You can see it in his spacing, you can see it in his aggression. He just knows exactly where he needs to be at all points in time, and he continues to execute on it. But like I said, Cloud9 really knew the strategy going into this series. They targeted Jojo Pume. They really wanted to make sure that Jace couldn't generate an early lead. Like I said, for Evil Geniuses, they're really focused on being able to get Jojo out on the map, trying to get him into a good position to be able to help out the rest of the lanes. And when they can't do that, I do think that the game plan kind of falls apart here, although I do think they did a good job trying to rally back around that, especially Unforgiven in the bot lane, who I think had a good game. But Eminus was really good. Blabber, I thought, had a really good game plan. And even though Fudge was kind of bad in this game on the Aatrox, and I'll quickly do an aside on the Aatrox, North America has very much an increased priority on this champion as opposed to basically any other region in the world. We're really not seeing Aatrox anywhere else in pro play, but we're seeing it here in the LCS, and we're seeing it quite a bit in the NACL as well. It's really interesting to see the priority that this region has placed on that champion, because I get it. Like, I understand what it does, and I know it's kind of a solo queue, super pick right now, but I just don't think it benefits from a lot of the things that are in pro play at the current moment. Obviously, Rumble and things like Renekton are just going to be basically better versions, but even something like Jax, which was banned this game, worth noting, but I would consider those higher priority than something like an Aatrox, even though we're continuously seeing it rise. Gonna be interesting to see if that continues to be a thing for North American teams. Maybe it's doing really well in scrims, but Fudge was kind of bad in this game. He almost single-handedly lost it for Cloud9. I shouldn't say single-handedly. That's not entirely fair. He just had a couple of really bad moments. I was tempted to give him dud of the game, but I didn't think that was entirely fair. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Jojo Pune on the other side for Evil Geniuses. Just not a good performance. Like I said, a lot of resources went into shutting him down, and he was absolutely shut down. This Jace did absolutely nothing in this game, and while Evil Geniuses did have a chance to be able to win it, most of that was a couple of good engages from Ayla, Unforgiven getting super fed, and Armeo on this Ivern actually being able to try and assist him and help him out, but it just wasn't enough. They didn't have enough firepower to be able to go up against Cloud9, and they made some really poor decisions in the back half of the game. Unforgiven played super well up until the point where he died, and he was doing less damage in the back half of this game than an Ashe, which is just really not acceptable. And so, a couple of things that I think really held Evil Geniuses back and really pushed Cloud9 forward, but the series is now at 1-0 in favor of Cloud9. You do not want to give this team too many advantages, and 2-0 is a massive advantage in a series like this. And so Evil Geniuses is going to need to bunker down. They're going to need to be able to pick up this game number 2, because winning 3 in a row against a team that you have not been able to beat all split long, it's just not a circumstance that you want to put yourself in. But for Cloud9, you're already feeling super good going into this series. I think game one only furthers that, right? Evil Geniuses kind of got everything they wanted in the mid game, and yet you still were able to come out on top by just kind of being better over the back half. Definitely a confidence booster. If you're able to get that 2-0 series lead, I can't even imagine how you would feel coming out of that. And so very excited to jump into this game number 2, but a very, very big one for both of these teams. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, we're going to find out right now, because the winner of game number 2 was Cloud9. They are going to take game number 2 here. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and that's what you want to see from C9. I know that there are still a lot of people out there that look at the way that Cloud9 plays the game and doesn't see it as entirely sustainable, and to their credit, I do agree to an extent. We will obviously talk about them in a grander scheme some other time, but you can't deny just how dominant they are when they are the better team in a series and when they do have their opponent scouted out, like Cloud9 clearly does in a series like this. Incredibly good gameplay coming in from this team. It's a very risky draft here. You basically have no fallback plan if things don't end up working out for you in the early to mid game with your strategy of shutting down the Jace and shutting down Jojo Pume. If you let that Jace get online, and if you let this Aphelios or this Aatrox end up causing problems, you really don't have a lot of easy answers to that in this comp, and so you're really relying on you being basically just the better team by a large margin, and luckily for C9, they kind of were in this game, and it really does seem like they are going up 2-0 in this series. This is disaster for Evil Geniuses. We'll talk about them in a second, but player of the game for me is going to go to Eminus in the mid lane. We talked about how Jojo Pume obviously is kind of the central structure that everything on Evil Geniuses is rotating around, and Eminus is going to be a player that is going to be receiving a lot of resources due to that fact in this series, and man, has he paid it back out in full. You can't really complain about how Eminus has been able to play out this series so far. He ends up picking up the R5 Gragas, which we're really not seeing basically at all in the meta anymore. We're seeing it a little bit in the top lane. You know, basically the players that are good at Gragas are still picking him in the top lane. 369 in particular over in the LPL, and the LPL in general is really the only region that's still picking the champion, but mid lane Gragas has pretty much entirely become extinct across the summer split, and so to see Eminus pull it out here in game number 2 and just dominate on it, do so much damage, engage so efficiently, just be so proactive on the map for this team, it's very difficult to deal with. I can't even imagine what Evil Geniuses should have done in a situation like this. It's going to be very difficult to shut down, so good stuff coming in from Eminus, but obviously he was enabled a ton by the rest of this team. Blabber had another really good game here. He's going into Armeo, and quite frankly, he's just gapping him in every single aspect. As much as I do like Armeo, Blabber's just on a different level in terms of skill and in terms of what he's able to output, you know, results-wise, I guess you can say. Blabber's arguably a top 1 or 2 player in North America at the current moment. Obviously, him and Berserker, 2 teammates, are probably 1A, 1B in terms of what they're able to accomplish, but Blabber on the Kha'Zix in particular, you're giving him all the resources he needs in order to be aggressive, in order to try and be that big carry in the early game, and I do think that he absolutely paid it out. It's funny how a lot of the attention and a lot of the proactivity that he did spend was in the mid lane, and therefore, he ended up making himself more of a facilitator, and that's always been what Blabber ends up doing, is he'll pick things like this, or the Kindred, you know, and he'll end up being more of a facilitator on those picks because he's just so proactive with his ganking presence that his laners end up getting so fed in the process. And so good stuff from Blabber. Berserker continues to just be awesome. I mean, he does so much consistent damage on a pick like Kai'Sa. You just can't really allow him to have it. Sven was really good on the Rel. I really liked how he's played this entire split. And Fudge had some moments. Again, I still think he's been relatively inefficient this series in terms of what he's been able to output. And I would argue that, you know, this is one of his worst splits in North America, which is crazy to say, in my opinion. Mostly just because, like, this is still a pretty good split in the grand scheme of things. It wasn't quite as good as Spring. Certainly not as good as Spring, in my opinion. But I think he's been a little bit more rocky. But that should just go to show you where Fudge is at as a player. This is a very dangerous collection of 5 players on one team, and they continue to show that. But for Evil Geniuses, it just doesn't feel like they're going to be able to keep up in this series. Dud of the game is going to go to Jojo Pume once again. Really frustrating to see Evil Geniuses still rely on this strategy. It's clearly not going to work for them. I talked about how maybe I felt a little bit better about them going up against actual good teams because I do like the talent around Jojo, and while I do think obviously their game plan does revolve a ton around Jojo, he's very good at being able to still be relevant from behind in most circumstances, but this series so far has just been a nightmare for him, and quite frankly, every single matchup they've had this year against Cloud9 Cloud9 has kind of been a nightmare for him. It just feels like a terrible matchup, and it does concern me because this is a team that really does want to go to Worlds, and this is not a Worlds caliber performance. If Cloud9 is going to be the best team here in North America, Evil Geniuses needs to show that they can at the very least try and step up to them, try to keep things interesting, and I just don't think they've been able to do that. Obviously, everybody else is not playing particularly well. Revenge is certainly playing a lot worse in this series than he did in round number 1. Armeo has just been run around the map by Blabber, basically in both games, especially early on. And while I do think Unforgiven and Ayla have been the best part of Evil Geniuses, I certainly don't think that means a lot. They're still not nearly as effective as Berserker and Sven on the other side of the map, and Unforgiven still needs to do so much more with the gold that he is given on the Aphelios in the late game. I know that obviously if you don't have a ton of peel in the back half as an immobile champion like the Aphelios, it can be a little bit difficult to do your thing, but the team's really relying on him to be able to do damage and to be able to keep the game alive, and I just don't think he's been able to do that all that consistently. Like I said, EG just feels outmatched, and I don't really know what they do here. You now have to win 3 games in a row against Cloud9 in order to take this series. That's going to be a really difficult thing to do, but again, you got to start it here in Game 3. If you don't win Game 3, then you can't even have the chance to win the rest, and so C9 looking to close out our series here in a sweep, and Evil Geniuses looking to keep their winner's bracket hopes alive here. So let's go ahead and find out if they can. It's game number 3 coming up, and the winner of game number 3 was Cloud9. They are able to take game number 3. They're going to close out this series in a clean sweep, and this is, I think, how some people expected this series to go. Not so much me. I thought Evil Geniuses would put up a little bit of a better fight in this series, but Cloud9 really is far and away the best team in North America at the current moment. They've been the best team in North America all year long. They've been the most consistent team in the West all year long, and they've just been everything that you could want out of an NA number 1 seed. The only thing that you could potentially ask more for is better early games, because they really struggled in the early game in this series, but it didn't really matter. They're so much more talented than everybody else that they played against in terms of what they were doing, like, that it didn't matter. They were going to win a team fight at 25 minutes no matter what the goal deficit was, and that ended up being how this game went. We talked about it a lot in game number 1 as well. Those were the 2 games where it really stood out the most, and you got to give them credit for being able to keep their head in the game, not give up, not just say, let's go next, we're up 2-0, we can afford to lose this. They stayed in the game, they were able to win a team fight from just being mechanically superior, and they were able to move on officially to the World Championships. They're going to qualify for Worlds with this win, as I talked about at the beginning of this video, but for Evil Geniuses, their run is not done. We'll talk about them in a bit. Player of the game for me, though, in game number 3, and player of the series as a whole, no-brainer here, is going to go to Berserker in the bot lane. He was phenomenal. He's so much better than everybody else in North America, and I know that that's going to be the big concern with Cloud9 in general, and trust me, again, I'm still there with you. This team is incredibly inconsistent at being able to do the technical things well, right? What they really get by on is their skill, and that's something that probably won't translate as well into an international stage where they're playing some of the more talented teams in the entire world. You can't just out-talent, JD Gaming or Billy Billy or KT Rolster or whoever, right? You can't just out-talent them. It's not going to happen, but Berserker's pretty darn good. Like, he's one of the few players that I truly do believe is world-class. Like, I don't remember a player in North America that I've considered world-class in the same way that I've considered Berserker world-class right now. I really do think he's that good. He's the best player NA has seen in a very long time, and Cloud9 should be very, very happy to have him. He's awesome. I mean, he's just unreal in terms of the late-game team fighting, in terms of the consistency with the damage he's able to output. It doesn't even really matter what champion he's on. He's just able to be that much better than everybody else he's going up against. He played Ezreal here in game number 3, and he made Ezreal look like the most broken AD carry in the entire game. The amount of damage he was able to output on that champion in the late game teamfights would make you think that he was stronger than, peak Kai'Sa at the current moment, which is just not the case for anybody else operating on him. And so Berserker really is that good. If you ever wanted a litmus test as to whether or not Berserker deserves the hype, yes, Berserker deserves the hype, as we can see here. Blabber continues to be awesome on the Maokai in particular. He cannot lose on this pick. This team is so dominant when he gets to pick the tree. It's actually absurd, and he had another really good game here. Sven had a really good series overall, especially in the back half of these games, setting up for Berserker. I think without the Maokai, without the Rel, this game becomes a lot harder for the Ezreal to actually be able to take over in, but lucky for him, he had those. Fudge had probably his best game of the series here in game number 3, which is really nice, and Emin is probably probably had his worst game of the series here in game number 3, ironically enough, was the target of a ton of aggression and just resources from the side of Evil Geniuses, and he didn't necessarily hold up on the Jace in the early game of pick. That clearly didn't work for either team in this series, but it didn't matter. The rest of Cloud9 was too good. Even when they were down, what was it, 5, 10k gold at some point in this game, it never really felt like it. They were able to win every single fight that they needed to over the back half of the game, and they are going to be walking out of this series with a clean 3-0 win, and they're going to be moving on to the World Championships, the Swiss stage as well. No play-ins for them. They are guaranteed a spot at Worlds. No regional qualifying series against Europe needed. Cloud9's going to be heading to Worlds, and not that that was ever really up for debate. And then for Evil Geniuses on the other side, again, they're not officially eliminated or anything. They're going to be moving down into lower bracket, which I think might be good for them. I think more games might actually be a positive for EG. You know, obviously, depending on who they end up going up against, that's going to be a little bit of a different conversation, but they just weren't good enough in this series. There really is no other way to put it. They were outskilled, they were outclassed, and their game plan completely fell apart. A lot of these players ended up having a lot poorer series than what they had been used to in North America. And again, I think it just goes to show you how much further ahead Cloud9 is as opposed to everybody else, you know, mechanically and talent-wise. But Shaden, worth noting, was in here for game number 3. Armeo played games 1 and 2. Shaden came back in for game 3. Didn't really do anything. Like, Blabber was a little bit worse in the early game here. Shaden definitely more aggressive in terms of how he wanted to play the matchup, and I would argue Shaden still is better for this team, or at least, you know, is relatively comparable. I don't think either has really separated themselves as being awesome. I think Shaden, the aggressiveness is certainly intriguing, and I think this game would show you that maybe Shaden deserves some more time, but Armeo's obviously a really good player in his own right. The problem this game was just the fact that they couldn't hold on to the lead that they were able to generate. My dud of the game is going to go to Revenge in the top lane. He was the most inconsistent player across this entire series. You could give that to JoJo. I think it's more than, you know, worthy to go to JoJo, but he was pretty good here. In game number 3, he was way better than Eminence in the early laning phase, which is actually kind of difficult as the Azir into the Jace, but Shaden did a really good job of trying to set him up for success. And again, that's Evil Genius's strategy. JoJo was actually able to get out on the map, which you wouldn't expect on a pick like Azir. That's not necessarily what you want him to do, but he was really good at that this game. And the problem was, again, just the lack of being able to win a team fight towards the back half of the game that ended up holding them back. Unforgiven and Alo were fine. This series, certainly not the problem, but again, tempo-wise, Evil Geniuses never had a shot. If you can't beat Cloud9 even up 5, 10k gold, you're just not going to be able to beat them. It's not going to happen. You had a hyper-scaling team comp with Azir, with Kai'Sa, with Sejuani, and you couldn't end up beating Ezreal Jace, and that's just a little bit of a problem and something that is definitely going to be talked about amongst Evil Geniuses. But like I said, they're going to lower bracket. We'll talk about their upcoming opponent at the end of the video, kind of previewing that series, but for now, hopefully the extra games do them good. I still think that this could be a team that ends up finishing top 3, or hell, even better if everything goes right for them, but at the current moment, clearly they're just not on the same level as the best team in the league in Cloud9, and that's what they proved across this series. A 3-0 sweep, going to Worlds, everything is clicking for Cloud9, and I can't imagine they could be happier right now. And then moving on to our second series of the winners round number 2, and this one was very intriguing. I think you could talk about Cloud9 and Evil Geniuses potentially being more interesting on paper because, again, higher seeds, but especially with how things ended up panning out in that series and in the first round, this series is one I was very much looking forward to. We had the number 2 seeded Golden Guardians taking on the number 5 seeded NRG, and I'm really excited to kind of see how this plays out. Obviously, Golden Guardians have been awesome over the course of this year. They've surprised everybody with their performance. Not only were they really good, obviously, in the summer regular season, being able to grab that number 2 seed, only because they lost the tiebreaker to Cloud9 for the number 1 seed in the playoffs, but this team went to MSI as the number 2 seed out of North America, making finals for the first time in their organization's history last split, upsetting FlyQuest, really going on a major run. At times, they felt a little bit streaky in terms of what they've been able to accomplish. When they're feeling confident, they're a much, much more dangerous team than when they're not feeling confident, but they've been confident all split long, and I think a lot of people really have them in high regard, but Energy is certainly not a team to scoff at. I think that one of the biggest positives that Energy has had over the course of this year is their upper mobility, I guess you can say. They really are a little bit of a Jekyll and a Hyde kind of team. When they play well, I mean, they really are good enough to beat anybody in the entire league, and that includes Cloud9. They're one of the few teams that actually is just talented enough to be able to take down the best teams, but man, They are crazy inconsistent in terms of when they come out. They're a very feast or famine team. I know I use that phrase a lot on this channel, but I think it very much does apply to NRG. You have players like Dokla and Contracts and Palafox and even FBI and Ignar that really are kind of coin flippy in terms of whether or not you're going to get the best or the worst versions of them on any given day. NRG can beat anybody in the league, and they certainly can beat Golden Guardians, but that's going to be more due to whether or not they step up rather than, you know, they're just definitely talented enough. You know what I mean? They have the talent. Players like Palafox and Contracts have had phenomenal splits and really do deserve a lot of credit. You know, players like FBI and Ignar, I think, have gotten a ton better over the course of this split, and I really like Dokla. But Golden Guardians is crazy consistent, and they're rightfully going to be favorites going into this series. Almost all of these players were top 2 in All-Pro voting for everybody, not even just for me or for broadcast. Obviously, they were first or second team for All-Pro voting, all 5 of them, but I think almost everybody would agree on that, and so Golden Guardians definitely a scary team, but this is going to be a fun series, so let's jump right into it. Game number 1 is going to kick us off, and the winner of game number 1 was NRG. They are able to take the first game of this series. They're gonna go up 1-0, and this is how you set the pace for the rest of the series here. This is exactly what you want to see in a game 1. Not only did they play really well towards the back half, but they showed their resiliency, being able to come back from a pretty large gold deficit. Golden Guardians, very similar to a lot of the games we just talked about in the previous series, actually had a relatively large gold advantage in this game. They just were not able to hang on. It was generated a lot through mid lane, which I think is, you know, generally a positive in the LCS. Not a lot of mid laners are really good at playing from behind, but one of the few ones that is so good in the later half of the game is Palafox, and I do think, obviously, he was awesome. We'll get to him in a second, but Golden Guardians was really good in the early game, playing through Gory a lot of that time. The Jace was a really big kind of missing pick for both of the teams in the previous series, whether it was Jojo Pune or Eminus. Neither were really able to pilot it at a super high level. Gory, I think, did play well here, unfortunately for them, and for him, it just wasn't enough. For NRG, it was actually really tough to pick a player of the game because I think this was more of a team effort than it was one individual player just showing up and being better, but I'm actually going to give player of the game to Ignar in the support position. This was a player that I had almost completely written off by the time he joined NRG here. He had not really been all that good in the LCS over the past few years, whether that was on Dignitas, whether that was on Immortals. The last few stints of Ignar had just been incredibly poor, quite frankly, and it really hadn't seemed to be working in almost any capacity, and I did not think that was going to change on NRG. I like FBI as a player, and I thought Ignar would be solid enough, but I thought he was really getting signed for reputation more than any sort of, like, individual performances that he had shown in recent years, but he's really gotten good over the back half of the split. This is something that I talked about a lot in my weekly recap series, is that Ignar in particular has leveled up so much on his with his time here on NRG over the course of this split. He did start at the split really struggling. I think both him and FBI had a lot of problems when they kicked off the split, but I do think he's actually turned into one of the more consistent supports in the LCS over the back half, and this is a really good showing. Without the Maokai, I think a lot of these team fights over the back half of the game are incredibly difficult. We'll get to FBI in a second, because obviously he was the carry of this game, but I think without Ignar setting him up, it becomes significantly harder for NRG to win. But again, FBI did need to be the one to capitalize. I know a lot of people talk about Dokla, Contracts, and Palafox. You know, the 3 members of CLG that ended up coming over to NRG when the org bought the spot. But, you know, FBI and Ignar honestly shouldn't be going under the radar any longer. They were the driving force in this game, and they deserve a lot of the credit for being able to take it. Obviously, Kai'Sa is a ridiculously strong pick in the current meta, if you can get to that part of the game where Kai'Sa is going to be able to take over. But man, you know, her just firing W's from full screen and being able to chunk you for half your health, it's not a particularly fun thing to have to play into. I know people continuously complain about Zeri this, Zeri that, you know, whatever, right? Obviously, she was strong for an incredibly long amount of time, but I would take Zeri over this current version of Kai'Sa. I've talked about this in the LCK before, but I think this version of Kai'Sa is so boring to watch, but still, it's super effective, and you do got to give a lot of credit to FBI for knowing how to pilot it, so credit to this bot lane. Everybody else did play well. Like I said, Palafox was team fighting really well in the Azir. Contracts, I think, did a really good job setting up some plays, even if he wasn't as active in the early game as I would have liked. And Dokla was pretty good in that same vein as well. I just think NRG played the back back half of this game well, even if they weren't starting out incredibly fast. And then for Golden Guardians, you know, a rare loss for them. They didn't lose a lot in the regular season, and so it's going to be interesting to see how they end up responding, but this was not a pretty typical Golden Guardians game. Usually they're pretty good at closing things out from an advantage. Now, this was something that they struggled with in spring, being able to close out games entirely efficiently, but it felt like something that they got a lot better at once they had their time at MSI and at the international event, playing against some really good teams, but not so much in game number 1 here. Dud of the game is going to go to Huhi for me in the support position. The Nautilus just really wasn't it this game. It was a massive support gap, in my opinion. Ignar just did so much more towards the back half than anything that Huhi was actually able to accomplish, and that's unfortunate, because I think Huhi's the best player on this Golden Guardians team, and so to see him struggle so much in game 1 is definitely frustrating, but I think River really had a bad back half of the game on the Sejuani. A lot of the frontline engage just didn't show up. Gory, you know, fell off pretty hard on the Jace, a champion that, you know, kind of does fall off, but still can be relevant in the back half. A lot of his good plays were at the beginning of the game, and even with Azeri, you're just never going to be able to outdamage a Kai'Sa plus an Azir. You need somebody else to step up. You were hoping that could have been Licorice on this really strong Rumble pick, but again, it just wasn't panning out for this Golden Guardians team. They were able to generate that early lead, but if you're not able to close out games, none of it matters, as we learned with Evil Geniuses earlier. So really nice win for Energy, but Golden Guardians is definitely going to want to tie this series up at 1 apiece. Obviously, if Energy is able to get a 2-0 lead, it doesn't really matter that Golden Guardians was the favorite going into this series. They're the type of team that is going to be able to close it out relatively efficiently, especially if they're playing well. And so for Energy, this is a big game too. For Golden Guardians, it's a massive game number 2. Are they going to be able to take it? Or is Energy going to be able to take a dominant 2-0 lead in this series? Well, the winner of game number 2 was NRG. They are able to take game number 2. They're going to take a dominating 2-0 lead in this series, and things are not looking good for the number 2 seeded Golden Guardians in this first series for them in the playoffs. This is not what I think they expected. They did not see Energy coming out and really kind of throwing down the gauntlet, quite frankly, going for a Renekton Nidalee comp in game number 2 here with the Jace, with the Kai'Sa. Not really a lot of backup plans if things don't work out in the early game like they did the first game, and so really good to see Energy actually be able to kind of fulfill the premise, if you will, of this comp. If they don't win early, they're in a really bad state, and so you're really saying, like, all right, we think we're better than you, we think we're going to be able to outskill you if you give us champions that we can be proactive and do something with in the early game, and you know what? They succeeded. They did everything that they needed to do, and they pulled off the win, which is massive for this team. Player of the game for me in game number 2 is going to go to Contracts in the jungle. I think this Nidalee was so influential on the outcome of this game. If you don't have the Nidalee just constantly creating problems, not only, you know, in the top lane, but mostly like mid and bot and just like everywhere on the map, quite frankly, then I think this game is so much harder. I think a lot of people are going to look at Palafox's damage, they're going to look at FBI's damage from the W, and they're going to see them as kind of the carries in this game, and I definitely understand why the perception would be that, but I think Contracts was by far the most important player on this team. Without Contracts, I do think this game is a lot harder. You're really relying on that Nidalee having good pathing and being able to make an impact early, and there's really no better player for that in the current kind of structure of the LCS than what Contracts has been. But like I said, everybody really did come to play in this one. Ignar was really good again on the Rel, but Palafox and FBI were your 2 major damage dealers over the back half of the game that did end up closing it out. This still went about 37-38 minutes, and so he still needed to actually play the game, right? As much as we're sitting here and talking about Nidalee and Jace and Renekton being able to do a lot in the early game and having a lot of prio and being able to generate tempo, you need to do something with that tempo, and while NRG was able to get some leads from it, if they weren't able to close out the game, this would have been a lot worse for them. But I think FBI played a really big part in why it was so easy for them to close it out, and I think Contracts played a really big part in why it was so easy for them to close it out. Overall, I would just say a good performance coming in from NRG and basically everything you wanted to see from them in game number 2. But for Golden Guardians, you're now down 0-2 against the number 5 seed in their first playoff series. That is not how you wanted to kick off the LCS championship, if you will, especially because the winner of this series goes to Worlds, and Golden Guardians, I think, are a team that everybody is kind of expecting to go to the World Championships, which is crazy to say considering their preseason expectations, but with everything that's happened over the course of this year, this has not been the way that I think Golden Guardians envisioned this series going. It really is almost everybody on the team underperforming. The one player that I think had a really good game number 2 and actually kept this game alive for a lot longer than it should have been was Licorice up in the top lane. Cassante is obviously a ridiculous champion, and especially watching it this game, it's like, oh my god, like, K'Sante can do literally anything he wants. But Licorice still has to pilot him at a high level, especially when the rest of the team, quite frankly, is not playing well up until this point. And I do think that Licorice kept it close, but there's only so much he can do. This bot lane's been very bad over the course of the first 2 games, and they've been incredibly consistent over the beginning part of the year. He's going to get another dead of the game, this time stealing away the Maokai support pick that Ignar used so well in game number 1, and I don't really know, man. Like, this is not particularly good. I don't know if I could expect Stixxay to be able to turn it around. He got kind of his signature pick here in the Tristana. That and Caitlyn are absolutely the 2 picks that I most associate with him as a player. The Tristana, obviously because of the classic Rage Blade Tristana, and Caitlyn just in general because he's really good at the champion, but to see Stixxay struggling on it is certainly concerning. Gory's basically been a non-factor over the beginning couple of games. Jace was obviously important in game 1, but the Lissandra basically did nothing in game 2, and River got completely out-jungled. You need this Viego to scale up and get online by the time you hit that 25-30 minute mark into the game, and yet somehow, someway, the Nidalee was just more useful. The poke comp on the side of NRG made it really difficult for the Viego to actually be able to survive and play the game, and River really didn't get to do anything this game because of that. He was constantly in fear of actually being able to check anything as the Viego, and therefore, the teamfight stage where Viego usually excels was just not a priority for Golden Guardians, and so there are definitely some major concerns with this team. There are definitely some things that have been arisen over the course of these first couple of games, but they now got to win out. They have to win 3 in a row in order to win this series. Energy have put themselves in a phenomenal spot. They just have to win 1 of the final 3 games, and they're going to be heading to the World Championships in their first ever split as an org. I know a lot of people were frustrated when Energy came in because CLG was going out, but the heart and soul of that team is absolutely still here, and they are now 1 game away. Are they going to be able to do it just like Cloud9 did in a 3-0 sweep, or is Golden Guardians going to put up at least a little bit of a fight and keep this series alive? Well, we'll find out right now, because the winner of game number 3 was Golden Guardians. They are able to take game number 3. They're going to keep themselves alive at the very least for 1 more game here, and they are going to show that they can at the very least win a game against NRG, which is good to see considering how this series has gone up until this point. But another example of things not exactly being super straightforward between North American teams. Basically every game that we've covered in this video here today has not been particularly clean from either side, and you know what? Like, you can say what you want about what that means internationally for NA's best teams, or, you know, etc., why the LCS is the worst major region. You know, we've heard it all, and all of it's probably true, right? Where these teams aren't just, they're not as clinical, right, as the rest of the teams that you're going to be seeing, especially coming out of the East. But what you can't say is that the LCS is not fun to watch. I've made the argument over the course of this year that the LCS has been the best of the major regions to watch, and I continue to make that argument. I think these games are so much fun, and I think you really should just go watch all of them. If I were you, I would just go watch the LCS, because I know they're not going to perform as well as you want internationally, but man, like, playing off against each other, this is fun League of Legends, and this is kind of what we've gotten all year long. So good for Golden Guardians, bringing out a lot of the pocket picks and being able to make them work. We see the Jarvan, we see the Taliyah coming out from this side. We saw a ton of this, obviously, over the course of Spring Split, but even just in general, these players have been willing to pull out these picks really regularly. Jarvan is just the River special at this point, and he's going to get my player of the game. It's so different watching him play Jarvan and watching basically anybody else play this champion. I consider Jarvan a rather feast or famine jungler in the current meta, because he does do a lot of what, you know, champions like Vi or champions like Wukong do in that similar vein. The problem is that Jarvan's, like, worse from behind than arguably any of them are, right? When Jarvan plays from a negative state, he ults in and he dies, right? Like, just instantly. And obviously that can sometimes still be okay, but for the most part, Jarvan is not going to be good if he's not going to be able to survive. And you can say similar things about Vi, you can say similar things about Wukong, but I really do think that you need to be a good Jarvan player to pilot Jarvan, and River's a really freaking good Jarvan player. If they didn't have him this game, I think it would have been a lot more difficult for them to even come close to being able to win it. But obviously Gory pulling out his signature Taliyah in that same vein as well. Not just the Jarvan that ends up being kind of an out-of-meta signature pick coming out here. The Taliyah gives the Jarvan so much more ability to play aggressive in the early game, kind of like he wants to do, because Taliyah can roam and get to those spots a lot quicker than the Azir can. And specifically, going into Azir, Taliyah can create so much havoc on the map and really be such a nuisance that the tempo and the pressure is almost always going to be in favor of Golden Guardians in this game. Now, things were not perfect. Energy actually was able to get a lot of gold on their 2 carries. Palafox and FBI, I think, both did a really good job job of generating gold in this game. The problem being the fact that in team fights, Golden Guardians just kind of outplayed them towards the back half. Licorice was relatively important. Stixxay was doing so much damage on a Kai'Sa pick. That is more than showing why it's got to be the highest prioritized AD carry in the game at the current moment across all 3 games here. Energy obviously using it very well in the first 2, and Golden Guardians using it very well here in game 3, and then I think Huhi had a better game. Still some unfortunate, I'll say, engages on Rakan, but in general, this was definitely better than games 1 and 2. I'm still a little bit concerned because Huhi has not been playing well in this series, but I would say in the grand scheme of things, Golden Guardians definitely played this game well. And then for Energy on the other side, you're definitely going to be a little bit frustrated with this. You had some opportunities to win this game, quite frankly. There were a couple of decisions, obviously FBI and Dokla not backing, like there were a couple of things that I think could have ended this game, and Energy could be going to Worlds with the 3-0 sweep right now, but again, it's only 1 loss. You're not going to worry too much. A couple of players I do think underperformed towards the back half of the game, but I do think for the most part, everybody was at least competent in this one. My dud of the game is going to go to Dokla in the top lane. I think the K'Sante was actually not very good coming out from Dokla. We saw the K'Sante actually be really positive for Licorice on the other side of this matchup in game number 2. Dokla, I don't think piloted it nearly as well here in game number 3, but I think you could realistically give the dud of the game to FBI. In the bot lane, the Xayah just wasn't as impactful as she probably needed to be over the back half of this game, but in my opinion, this is not a comp where you really need to be relying on Xayah all that much, right? It's the Azir and the K'Sante that really should be doing a majority of the work, and the Xayah should be a secondary carry for this particular team comp. You have Ignar and Contracts trying to set things up, but the problem for Energy was just that they kind of got pulled in a bunch of different directions towards the back half of the game, and a really wild, chaotic finish ended up in favor of Golden Guardians, which is going to happen every once in a while, but you can't really let it get you down. As much as this game obviously mattered a ton, you still got 2 more games to close out the series, and Golden Guardians still has their back up against the wall. Just because they're starting to push themselves off does not mean that you can let your foot off the gas at this point. And so, obviously, Game 4 just going to be as important as Game number 3. Still a must-win for Golden Guardians, and Energy is still 1 game away from qualifying themselves for Worlds. Are they going to be able to complete it here in Game 4, unlike what they were able to do in Game 3, or is Golden Guardians going to start the reverse sweep and bring us to a Silver Scrapes Game number 5? Well, the winner of Game number 4 was NRG. They are able to take Game 4. They're going to take this series 3-1, and they are going to punch their ticket in their first ever split in the LCS. Well, I shouldn't say that. Their first split back in the LCS to the World Championships for the first time in their existence. Congratulations to this team. Congratulations to these players. 3 of which obviously had been on CLG before this for a year and a half, and man, did they really deserve it. Man, did they really play their hearts out here. But even FBI and Ignar played fantastic for this team, and you've just got to be excited for this collection of players to be heading to the World Championship. Golden Guardians going to be dropping down to the lower bracket. Of course, not eliminated just yet. They're still going to have a chance to put their name in the World's basket, but certainly not what they were expecting. They got blitzed in this series, and they simply were not ready for it, and they were not able to catch up. But let's go ahead and talk about Energy first and foremost. Player of the game and player of the series for me is going to go to Contracts in the jungle. Really good series coming out from Contracts, and this is the player that I think really pushed Energy forward the most in the regular season. I talked about it a ton in my playoff primer where I did my awards overview. He was the only Energy player that I put in my All-Pro picks. I had him as 3rd team All-Pro jungler behind River and behind Blabber, of course. But I do think that Contracts definitely deserved to be an All-Pro this split. I think he absolutely was snubbed, in my opinion, for that award. I know a lot of people think the same thing for Palafox. I'm kind of on the fence about that one, a little bit more so because I think Palafox is a little bit more inconsistent than people give him credit for. But Contracts, come on, man. Like, this dude has been so good. I think you could make an argument this is his best split ever. It's certainly up there. I mean, you've always seen Contracts have the high highs. Like, you've always seen him have the good games, but you've also always seen him have the really bad ones, and it just felt like he didn't have nearly as many bad ones over the course of this split. Even when this team was struggling a ton at the beginning of the split. Remember, they started like 1-4 or something like that. Certainly something that was pretty bad, and they didn't look all that competitive in that start either. Contracts was still playing well, even in their losses, and he was the one that was definitely dragging them to a lot of their wins in that same vein as well. And so to see him, you know, step up and push this team back to Worlds, him getting back there for the first time since the Cloud9 days, it's so awesome to see. And obviously that post-game interview was so wholesome. But the rest of this team also played well. Palafox was really good in this game. Felt like like he really stepped up on the Azir in game number 4. He had been pretty good over the course of this series. I don't think he was necessarily a major game changer for this team, but this was definitely his best game in my opinion in game 4. FBI and Ignar were major positives for this team over the course of this split. Or I should say over the course of this series, more so accurately. I think obviously game 1 was very significant from FBI and Ignar, and game 2 was still really good. FBI was pretty good here in game number 3, again taking more of a secondary carry role on the Xayah, something that I think this team has very much gotten used to, and Ignar was solid. Dokla, a little more up in the air. I like this gangplank game in game number 4. Kind of hard to say that, but I really like this GP game in game 4. I think it actually worked out quite a bit. Licorice was probably the better top laner across this series, but that's nothing to take away from Dokla. I still think that energy was more than enough to convince me that they deserve to go to Worlds, and clearly they deserve to go to Worlds because they've earned it in a series like this, so congratulations to them. But for Golden Guardians on the other side of the map, I can't imagine what is going through their head right now. A couple of players really underwhelming in their first playoff series of the split, most notably, in my opinion, the dud of the game here, and for all 3 games that they ended up losing in Huhi in the support position. He was their MVP over the course of the regular season. I had him number 2 in MVP voting in the regular season, actually. It might have been number 3, I don't remember. Either 2 or 3 with Blabber and then obviously JoJo. But, I mean, he was an MVP finalist for me, and so to see him struggle so much in the first series in the playoffs, it's kind of concerning. He's been a player that's really stepped up in the playoffs over the course of his career, whether that's been on CLG or on Golden Guardians here, or on 100 Thieves back in the day. You know, like everything that's kind of, you know, gone along with who he has been, a big game player kind of mentality, and I still definitely think that that's in there for him, but it's kind of concerning that it didn't necessarily come out in this series. He was outplayed by Ignar in basically every game. Now, his bot lane partner, not so much. While Stixxay did struggle a lot over the course of the first 2 games in particular, games 3 and 4 were Stixxay. Like, game 4 almost was single-handedly won by Stixxay on this Kai'Sa. This was the first game that Kai'Sa did end up losing, and it is worth noting that this champion does feel incredibly busted, but Stixxay still piloted it incredibly well. This wasn't, you know, APW spam Kai'Sa in game number 4. This was, I'm going to get in, I'm going to ult in, I'm going to try to auto-attack, and I'm going to try to 1v9, right? So credit to Stixxay, he tried his best, but it just wasn't enough. Licorice also, I think, had a really good series, and a really good game 4 here on the Poppy, a champion that I do think does relatively well, but it just wasn't enough. Jungle mid was significantly worse on the Jarvan Talia combo in game 4 than they were in game 3. I think they were kind of found out, if you will, and I think NRG did a much better job of adapting to it, but overall, Golden Guardian still has a lot that they can still accomplish. This is still a team that I think is going to expect themselves to be able to make the World Championships. They're still in a decent spot. There's 4 teams down in the lower bracket left. 2 of those teams will at the very least get a chance to play a best of 5 to go to Worlds, and so, you know, Golden Guardians definitely, I think, expects themselves to be one of those. It's going to be interesting to see if they can solve or fix some of the problems that ended up appearing in this series, but on the flip side, congratulations to NRG. They have more than earned their spot internationally, and I'm really excited to see what this kind of collection of North American talent, and Ignar, and I guess FBI, but come on, we count him at this point. I'm kind of interested to see what this collection of talent can do on an international stage. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCS Winners Round 2 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, up on the screen is the updated LCS Championship bracket, with Worlds qualification being entirely determined by this bracket. We can see that both NRG and Cloud9 have confirmed a top 3 spot, which means they both confirmed themselves in the Swiss stage at the World Championships. Congratulations to those 2. But we still got to figure out who the final 2 teams that get a chance to play for it are. Of course, one of those teams is going to auto-qualify for getting top 3, and then whoever gets 4th is going to get to play against Europe's 4th seed in a best of 5 to determine who gets into the play-in stage. So interesting stuff, but we got 2 matchups to preview very quickly here, starting with Golden Guardians and Dignitas. Really intriguing matchup, but on paper, this really should not be close. Golden Guardians should absolutely obliterate Dig. Dig is very slow, and they struggle with like heavy aggression coming out from the other side, and that's the best way I can describe Golden Guardians, is at their best, it's River and it's Huhi, just going in over and over. Stixxay playing super aggro, Gory moving around the map, Licorice not taking any shit. Like, I would expect Golden Guardians to have a phenomenal matchup, but again, they didn't look nearly as good into energy as maybe I would have expected, and Dignitas, it looked a lot better against TSM than I would have expected. If Jensen in particular can step up in the same way that he did in that first round series, I do think Dignitas has a shot, but I think they're going to need a pretty big miracle. Golden Guardians should take that relatively easily. And then the more interesting series in my eyes, Evil Geniuses and Team Liquid. One of these teams is not going to Worlds. Pretty wild to say that, but that's the situation we have found ourselves in. The winner of this will be in a relatively good spot, and I honestly think this is a very difficult series to call. Evil Geniuses kind of got found out in this series, with JoJo being shut down a little bit more efficiently and them not really having a great answer to it, but Team Liquid's also incredibly inconsistent. If Pioshik and Summit and, a lot of these more inconsistent players on Team Liquid can step up and have a really good series, I would expect them to be able to move on. But Evil Geniuses is also crazy talented. It's going to be a really fun back and forth. Honestly, I think I would lean a little towards TL at the current moment, but it's not by a ton. I think EG could easily win so long as they get to play their strategy, and maybe we see some step-up moments from players like Revenge or Unforgiven that take kind of the weight of the game off of JoJo just a little bit, but definitely going to be a more intriguing of the two kind of losers round 2 matchups, if you will. But let me know down in the comment section below what you guys think of the 2 upcoming series. Who do you think is going to be moving on, and how do you think Energy and C9 will do at Worlds? Would love to know you guys' thoughts. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about all 4 of the major regions. The LPL, of course, just wrapped up, but coming up tomorrow, we're going to have a couple more videos coming out on the LCK, and so, in the NACL as well, I should say. And so if you're interested in that kind of content, go ahead and hit subscribe. Hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. Of course, we'll also be covering the rest of the LCS playoffs, so you definitely don't want to miss that. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.